Hello, this is Brian Otten of Apologetics315. Today's interview is with Robert M. Bowman, Jr., the Director of Research at the Institute for Religious Research. He is the author of nearly 60 articles and of a dozen books, and these include Faith Has Its Reasons, an integrative approach to defending the Christian faith, 20 Evidences that God Exists, and also Putting Jesus in His Place, the Case for the Deity of Christ. The purpose of this interview is to learn a bit more about Rob and his work, take a look at apologetic methodologies, and get his advice for those defending the faith. Well, thanks for joining me today, Rob.
My pleasure.
Well, first off, I want to thank you for your work. Two of your books that I've read have been a couple of my favorites, The Faith Has Its Reasons and 20 Evidences that God Exists, and I think both are excellent, so I look forward to getting to some of your other titles in the future.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
First, before we get started with the main area of our interview, I wanted to find out more about your background and your experience in Christian apologetics.
Okay. I've been involved in Christian apologetics in one form or another, or context or another, pretty much my whole adult life, mainly because I had a need to pursue issues in Christian apologetics for myself and wanted to know the answers to certain questions. And as I dug into those and researched and thought about things and wrote down what my thoughts were and so forth and so on, I developed an interest in the broad field of Christian apologetics and found myself having opportunities to share with others and do some teaching and some writing and so forth, and as people say, one thing led to another. So I've been involved in Christian apologetics really my entire adult life, beginning when I was in college and had questions once I became a Christian, had questions about how do we know the Bible's true and, so forth and so on.
Now, you're currently working with the Institute for Religious Research. Can you tell me about that organization and what you do there and what the main focus of the work is?
Yes, I've been with the Institute for Religious Research now for about 2.5 years. Prior to that, I've worked for various apologetics-related ministries, some of which people may have heard of, such as the Christian Research Institute or the Apologetics Department of the North American Mission Board. And then about 2.5 years ago, as I said, I became part of the staff of IRRorg, which has been around for about 25 years or so. And the Institute for Religious Research is an apologetics ministry that is focused primarily on providing resources pertaining to Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses, and similar groups. And Mormonism would be their number one subject area, although there's a desperate need for general apologetics resources, even for people that are coming out of Mormonism. In fact, something that we had a discussion about this morning in our staff meeting, because a lot of people come out of these groups, again, any group that you can think of, and they have questions about how do we know the Bible's reliable, how do we know the right books are in the Bible, how do we know this is historically credible, et cetera, et cetera. So we deal with those kinds of issues as well as issues specific to Mormonism or to some other group of that nature. And I'm doing a lot of research on Mormonism myself. In fact, the last couple of years I've been doing more and more research specifically on the Book of Mormon, and that's currently a major research focus of mine.
So if someone wants to find resources on Mormonism or Jehovah's Witnesses, they can go to IRRorg and they can find a lot of articles and things of that nature?
That is correct. IRRorg is our website. That's IRRorg, and we have a lot of resources on Mormonism. We have some resources on Jehovah's Witnesses, and that's growing a little bit. I myself have written 4 books on the subject of Jehovah's Witnesses. That's what I was doing a lot of writing on when I was first getting going professionally, if you might excuse the term, back in the late 80s and early 90s. I did a lot of work in that area. I'm trying to do the same thing with Mormonism that I did with Jehovah's Witnesses, which is focus on the relevance of biblical studies, biblical scholarship to the claims made by these religious groups. And that is major need in Mormonism, because Mormon apologetics leans very heavily on a kind of misuse of biblical scholarship to try to defend really everything, the Book of Mormon and the other Mormon scriptures, Joseph Smith's unusual theology, and so forth. And so that's a major concern I have, is showing where they're misunderstanding the Bible and misusing biblical scholarship to try to defend the Mormon scriptures and teachings.
Well, excellent. Well, maybe someday in the future I want to interview you along those lines, because it's such a deep topic. But today, sure, I want to focus our attention on some of the content that you cover in the book that you co-authored with Ken Boa called Faith Has Its Reasons, Integrative Approaches to Defending the Christian Faith, which, for those who are listening, I think it's one of the best apologetics books about apologetics and methodology. So can you kind of talk about why we should even study the methodology behind our defense of the faith?
Sure. Well, many people, I think, have this idea that we really don't need to do that because we just kind of jump in and defend the faith. But the problem with that is that if you don't think about method at all, then you may be making a lot of mistakes along the way. C.S. Lewis once said something along the lines of, we need to do good philosophy, if for no other reason than to counter bad philosophy. And the point there is that if you just assume that you have a good method and you don't ever examine what you're doing and why you're doing what you're doing, then you may be hitting your head up against the wall and not even realize it. Apologetic methodology is really about the study of understanding why there is a disconnect between what we say when we're talking to non-believers, which we think is, good reasons for belief, good solid facts to back up what we're saying, and so forth. Why there's a disconnect between how we perceive the evidence that we're presenting and how the non-believer perceives it, and what can be done, if anything, to help overcome that, or to use the way that we present the material to facilitate overcoming some of those obstacles to faith, some of those blockages or disconnects on the part of the non-believers and their thinking processes as they process and think about the same things that we're trying to talk about. So that's really what apologetic methods and methodology is about. If it was a simple matter of saying, here is the Christian message, here are the facts that support it, and the non-believer in perceiving those and hearing that would immediately see that it's true and accept it as true, we might not need to look at methodology. But unfortunately, that doesn't happen a lot of the time, and there are reasons for it that the study of apologetic methodology seeks to address.
Well, I want you to lay out, if you could, the different categories that you and Ken Boa use in the book to classify the various methodologies or approaches. And I know you could probably go into huge detail in these, but you don't have to do that at the moment. Lay them out in general, and then we can kind of go from there.
Sure, absolutely. Well, there are four basic categories of approaches that we talk about in the book. The first would be what is commonly called classical apologetics, which is an approach to apologetics that emphasizes deductive reasoning, deductive rationality, logical argumentation as the crucial consideration, the crucial standard and approach to knowledge that is to be emphasized and given priority in defending the truth of Christian faith. So that would be the classical approach. And that the term classical apologetics is used because, at least in the opinion of those who espouse this method, and in the opinion of many that don't, this is the view that or approach that has dominated most of the history of Christian apologetics. Not all, of course, but much of it, if not most of it. And the second approach, and really the other three approaches that I'm going to mention here, are all modern responses to philosophical and cultural developments in the modern world that have made the traditional or classical approach to apologetics not always seem as persuasive or successful as we might like, or perceiving that there is a need for some change or some adaptation in light of the modern situation. And the second then approach is called evidentialism, or evidential apologetics. Evidentialism in this context simply means an approach to the defense of the Christian faith that emphasizes empirical evidence, factual support, factual information presented and marshaled in a reasonable way to show that Christianity is true. Whereas classical apologetics historically tend to be very oriented around philosophy and logic, evidentialism has tended to focus either on scientific evidences or historical evidences, or possibly both and other types of evidences as well. But science and history would be especially relevant categories of study for those who are of an apologetic persuasion that is, or approach that is classified as evidentialism. These two schools of thought, classical and evidential apologetics, are very compatible with one another, very closely related in some ways. Evidentialist apologists very often use classical arguments and vice versa. There's a great deal of overlap between these two schools of thought. The third approach is quite different in some ways and is self-consciously intended to be quite different. It's the broad term that I like to use for this third approach is Reformed apologetics. Reformed meaning Calvinist in its theological orientation, as well as self-consciously seeking to reform Christian apologetics in the light of certain theological truths that are especially emphasized and articulated in the Calvinist or Reformed tradition.
When you're talking about Reformed apologetics, would you say that if you're Reformed, then you're automatically do Reformed apologetics? Or can
No.
You would say Reformed people may embrace this or they may not?
That's correct. Not all Calvinists, not all Reformed thinkers embrace what we're talking about here as Reformed apologetics. Mm-hmm. Some do and some don't. Certainly, for example, if you were to look at somebody like Charles Hodge or B.B. Warfield, they were as Reformed and Calvinist in their theology as you could ask, but they were not advocates of what we're talking about as Reformed apologetics. Mm-hmm. R.C. Sproul is an example of a contemporary Reformed theologian whose approach to apologetics is more or less in the classical tradition rather than the Reformed apologetics tradition as I'm using it, that expression. Now, Reformed apologetics includes, but is not limited to, what is often called presuppositionalism. Presuppositionalism, and there's actually a couple of varieties of that as well, but presuppositionalism is basically a kind of Reformed apologetics which was developed by a couple of American Calvinist theologians and philosophers, Gordon Clark and Cornelius Van Til. And those two men developed rather different versions of presuppositionalism, but they both argued that the only way to show non-Christians that Christianity is true is to present a rational argument. It's not being unreasonable here, but present a rational argument that proceeds on the assumption or the presupposition that Christianity is true. In other words, you don't try to argue up to the truth of the Christian faith, but you argue, here is what Christianity says. It is true. When you see that it is why it's true, then you can see that that you should believe it. I'm trying to keep it very popular level here, but basically it is an approach that says the only faithful way to defend the Christian faith is to argue on the presupposition that it is in fact the truth. There's a lot more to that. We could go into that later in the discussion if you like. Mm-hmm. Then the fourth approach is called fideism. Now, fideism, or fideism, some people pronounce it, The word fideism comes from the Latin fide, meaning faith, and fideism is the position that Christianity should not be defended rationally or intellectually in a kind of philosophical or logical or scientific or a dogmatic way. That it should not be. You can't, or you shouldn't try to present reasoned arguments to persuade non-Christians intellectually that Christianity is true. So, in fact, fideism is a kind of anti-apologetic stance, and yet the primary advocates of fideism historically have presented what could be described, and some of them have described, as a kind of indirect defense of the Christian faith. And I'm thinking here especially of somebody like Søren Kierkegaard, the 19th century Danish Christian philosopher, or the 20th century Swiss theologian Karl Barth is another example of somebody that does this. Fideism is often characterized as a form of irrationalism, but fideists, generally speaking, don't admit that or don't agree with that. They see their approach as the only reasonable one because, in fact, Christianity cannot be defended in a direct, rationalistic or logical manner because Christianity proclaims paradox. It proclaims mystery. It proclaims a person, Jesus Christ, who defies, our sensibilities of what is reasonable and challenges us to rethink the way we view everything. So fideists are, generally speaking, not irrationalists, but they are suspicious of what they would consider to be rationalistic attempts to prove Christianity. They would say, you can no more do that than you, and no more should want to do that than you should want to try to offer 3 reasons why I love my wife. I'm a Christian because I love God, I love Jesus Christ, I trust Him, and if you're going to ask me to prove that He's trustworthy, that'd be like asking me to prove that I should have faith in my spouse. They see that as really in opposition to or antagonistic to what faith is really about, which is a relationship of trust and love with God and Jesus Christ. So those are the 4 major approaches. And then in our book, Faith Has Its Reasons, we talk about integrative approaches that appreciate the elements of 2, 3, or even all 4 of these approaches that we've talked about and try to integrate them in some way.
Okay. Well, I like what you do in that book because you've described here how these methodologies approach Christian defense, but in the book you demonstrate it by giving example conversations between someone who's a skeptic and someone who's using this different category of approach, and it really demonstrates how it would actually play out on the ground. Now, one other distinction you make in the book are between 2 sorts of questions. The apologetic questions are the ones that are aimed at the Christian faith, and what you call meta-apologetic questions. Those are the ones that deal with how should we defend the faith. And some of those are, for instance, on what basis do we argue that Christianity is the truth? Or what is the relationship between apologetics and theology? Or should apologetics engage in philosophical defense of the faith? Or can we use science to defend the faith? So I want to ask you to talk about how we would use these sorts of meta-apologetics questions to arrive at or determine how we approach actually defending the faith.
Well, sure. Let me give a very concrete example so that people can understand what we're talking about in a practical way. One of the apologetic questions that we talk about in the chat in the book and that we illustrate with each of these approaches is the perennial question: how do we know that God exists? Now, as an apologetic question, this invites the apologist, the Christian, to jump in and provide reasons or evidences to show that God exists. And these reasons might be, for example, scientific evidence for the creation of the universe, or scientific evidence for the supernatural origin of life. And these are often used arguments, evidences that Christians of different apologetic approaches as well may use in various ways to explain how we know that God exists. But the meta-apologetic question that would be relevant here is, can we use science to defend the Christian faith? There are some Christians who would say no, because science is always changing. Science is a fallible discipline. It is constantly in flux. Yesterday's scientific theories are tossed onto a scrap heap of discarded, obsolete, or discredited views, and we replace them for every generation or two with newfangled theories that will also eventually be discarded. And so there are Christians who are suspicious of or who are reticent to draw on scientific evidences or scientific arguments to try to show why it is reasonable to believe that God exists. There are other Christians who are very excited and passionate about using scientific evidence to show that God exists, to argue that modern science has actually provided an abundance of evidence for God's existence that were not accessible until modern times, until the 20th century. We now are able to prove that the universe had a beginning. We're now able to prove that the universe is designed. And so they are not only are they not hesitant to use these arguments, they are excited and passionate about using them. And so the meta-apologetic question is, well, can we use science to provide reasons for faith? And if we can, how should we go about doing that? And that is a question that would be worth thinking about before we simply jump in and say, yes, let's use this. No, let's not use that. The meta-apologetic question helps us to think clearly about what could we do and what are the limitations in using scientific arguments or scientific evidence to defend belief in God.
So, for instance, someone could take maybe various points of view in how they would arrive at their methodology. For instance, they might be somewhat pragmatic and they would say, this was persuasive to me. I think this will persuade others. This is the method I'm going to use. Or someone might say, here's my theology. My main aim here is to make sure that I'm in line with my theology. No matter what result, whether it's accepted or not, I'm honoring God. So I'm going to take this approach because I think this approach matches my theology. And, of course, there are all kinds of places on that spectrum that someone can be on, and they're not mutually exclusive. But what are the good questions that someone should be asking? I mean, we talked about, can we use science, but what are appropriate questions that one should be asking when they're thinking about, does my methodology, first off, honor God? Is it going to be persuasive? Is it demonstrated in the Scripture? What is your take on that?
Well, there are several questions that we can ask here that could be helpful in coming up with a very workable and sustainable and practical use of science in apologetics. We could ask such questions as, what is the relationship between science and theology? Does science confirm theology? Is it in tension with theology? Does it overlap? Do they deal with entirely different subject areas so that you really cannot cross from a scientific fact to a theological conclusion, or vice versa? There are those who would argue that science and theology are non-overlapping subject areas. Science tells us about the motions of the heavenly bodies and things like that. Theology tells us why God made it that way, why that is, because God made it. But it doesn't tell us how God did it. Theology on this view doesn't tell us what to expect when we examine the heavenly bodies. It simply says, whatever you see there, if you ask the question, why is it like that? Why is there beauty and grandeur and order and so forth in the universe? Well, it's because a loving and wise God made it. So there are those that would argue that they're totally separate. Then there are those who would argue they're not totally separate because science deals with the facts of the world that God made, And those facts are God-created facts. He made the universe that way. And furthermore, they would argue that the Bible at least touches on some of these issues pertaining to the nature of the cosmos. And we have to ask the question, can science and theology be shown to be in agreement if there is overlapping subject matter? I'll give you an example of an obvious place where we might expect to find that. The Bible teaches that God made the universe, that he created the heavens and the earth. It appears to indicate that this was done in what is called the beginning. That is, there's a beginning point in time when the universe comes into existence. So on the basis of revelation in Scripture, Christianity historically has held that the universe has not always existed, that it had a beginning. Now, science has investigated this very question, and there was a period of time in the 19th century in particular when astronomers and other scientists studying cosmology very often wanted to argue that the universe was eternal, that it has no beginning. And when they started finding evidence in the beginning decades of the 20th century that the universe had a beginning, this bothered many scientists. And it turns out the evidence amassed throughout the 20th century that the universe did, in fact, have a beginning. So there are Christian apologists who will say, you see, sometimes science and theology do overlap in their concerns. Both science and theology ask questions about whether the universe has a beginning. Theology has always, historically in Christianity, answered yes. Scientists have had different views on this, but now it looks like the scientific evidence has swung our direction, and it would be appropriate to point that out. So asking questions about the domains of science and theology, asking questions about the limitations of what science can demonstrate. Does science actually produce knowledge, or does it just produce sort of workable hypotheses that we can use to manipulate matter to run experiments and to create airplanes and things like that? But it doesn't actually give us knowledge of the real world. There are people that maintain that kind of non-realist view of science. Should we adopt a non-realist view of science, or should we not? Christians often assume that their view of science is the obvious and only correct view. It is helpful to be aware of the fact that there are different views on the nature of science and to think through the issues pertaining to that before trying to appeal to your understanding of science without having, as it were, gotten a good understanding of the lay of the land. And again, also on both sides. There are Christians who, you might say, take a kind of naively realist view of science, that whatever the scientists tell us, that's true. And there are those that take a naively non-realistic view of science, that science isn't really telling us anything about the real world. It's just telling us how to put things together so we can make stuff. Those are both uncritical and unrealistic, sort of naive views of science, and it is important to sort that out if we're to have a proper appreciation for the relationship between what science tells us and what we learn theologically from the Bible.
One of the things that I noticed when I read Faith Has Its Reasons or other books on methodology, such as 5 Views on Apologetics, it was immediately evident that you see an overlap between the various approaches. As you mentioned earlier, the classical approach overlapping in many ways with evidential approaches, and you see them borrowing from one another, and they're not in their own individual lanes. And so notable proponents of each of these approaches would agree. And I suppose many people, though, would notice, as you pointed out, that one of the biggest differences between these approaches is that presuppositional method. And you talked about how that sort of stands out. One question that would be in my mind, and maybe in other people's, is when an approach comes to the point of saying, this is the biblical way of doing things, how do most presuppositionalists arrive at saying this is the biblical way or the only God-honoring way? Where would you stand on that issue, and how would you reason through that?
Well, the presuppositionalist approach to this question that you've just raised is to say something like this. Look, in the Bible, God is the creator of everything that is not God. He is the creator of the universe. He is the creator of its order, of its rationality. He gives the world meaning. He gives the world purpose. He makes facts what they are. facts are what they are because God is the one who makes the world what it is. So God is the source of fact, of meaning, of purpose, of value, of logic, of reason, and all of these things. And so all of these things are reflections in our world, in our experience, and in our thinking. They are created reflections of the uncreated creator of all things. And so the presuppositionalist says any argument trying to reason up from specific facts or specific logical arguments or things of that nature to prove God exists are trying to reason, as it were, from the lesser to the greater. They're trying to reason up to the absolute origin of all these things by looking at specific facts or specific issues. When you really, from their perspective, you really can't do that. And it's not even really faithful to God to do that because it's treating these things as the givens, as the certainties, and treating God as the uncertainty that has to be proved. From their perspective, God is the certainty. And our empirical observations and our opinions and our forms of mental reasoning and so forth, those are the things that need to be tested, that need to be assessed, that need to be weighed against the revelation of the absolute certainty of what God is and what he has said in his word. So from their perspective, this is a theological argument from the nature of God and the nature of creation as revealed in Scripture, that this is how apologetics ought to be done. Now, interestingly enough, whereas the presuppositional case from Scripture for this approach is based on sort of the macro theological worldview, deduction from what Scripture says about God and man and so forth, whereas the presuppositionalist argues from this macro theological perspective of what the Bible says about God and the world and man to their apologetic approach. The evidentialist and classical apologist will typically appeal to specific biblical examples of people defending the Christian faith, of people defending the truth, as it were, in the real world, in the field. And so, for example, they will appeal to the kinds of reasoning that Jesus uses when he's talking to Pharisees, or they will appeal to Paul's speech in Athens as a paradigm or a model for evangelizing Gentiles, evangelizing those who do not have a background in biblical truth. So they will appeal to these specific examples of people defending truth in the Bible and not base their apologetic method on a sort of an overarching theological scheme. Now, in my opinion, if I may venture my own opinion on this, we need to consider both. We need to consider the theological worldview perspective on apologetic method, and we also need to look at how Jesus and the apostles and the prophets in the Bible actually defended the truth in the field. And I think that a whole well-rounded apologetic method is going to take both of those into consideration.
In your book, you basically outline what you call an integrative approach, and that's what you're alluding to there. Can you go into what that looks like and how, all these different approaches can contribute to having this holistic angle?
Sure. I think I need to make a qualification here, and that is that what we are advocating or encouraging in Faith Has Its Reasons is not what might be described as a fifth approach that we describe as integrative, like we have come up with the right way and it's some combination of the other four. People have taken us that way. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is this, that every one of these approaches, even the fideist approach, although that may be the hardest one to do this from, every one of these approaches can learn from the others, can have other, can be enriched by bringing in perspectives and insights from the other approaches. And that the more we do that, the more we integrate into our approach perspectives and insights from the other approaches, the more well-rounded and whole and potentially successful our defense of the Christian faith will be. So that we're not trying to convert evidentialists to a non-evidentialist position, for example. We're trying to encourage evidentialists to draw on the classical approach, to draw on the presuppositional approach, and even to learn something from the fideists that they can sort of put into their arsenal of arguments for the Christian faith. We're not trying to tell the presuppositionalists they shouldn't be presuppositionalists. We're trying to encourage them to see that there is a great deal to be learned from and to accept and to utilize from the other approaches, from the classical and evidentialist approaches, for example, within their presuppositional theological approach. So that we're not advocating one integrative approach that everybody is supposed to jump on that bandwagon, but rather we're encouraging a plurality of approaches. We're recognizing that there already are a plurality of approaches. We're not trying to fight that, but we're trying to encourage Christians of whatever approach they happen to use to be enriched from the other approaches.
Would you find any apologists, past or present, that you think would embody, a good example of this sort of approach?
There are several that come to mind. Francis Schaeffer would be a very famous example of a Christian apologist who embodied the desire to have an approach to apologetics that was sensitive to some of these different issues and drew on different approaches. Schaeffer probably would have been most comfortable being described as a presuppositionalist, but ironically, the presuppositionalists generally didn't view him in that way. They thought that he was muddying the waters because he wasn't pure from their perspective in advocating that approach. But Francis Schaeffer, his approach famously included what might be described as very rational elements that would be very compatible with the classical approach, and very pragmatic, personal, so-called existential elements that would be very compatible with and resonate with fideists. And yet he also drew heavily from, maybe even primarily from, Cornelius Van Til and the presuppositionalist tradition. So he's an example of somebody that did that, and he's one of the two most famous evangelical Christian apologists of the 20th century. And I think one of the reasons why he was so successful and why he was able to help so many people is that he was comfortable drawing from these different approaches and pulling them together in a way that worked as he talked with different kinds of people. Another example of a Christian apologist who is very integrative in his approach is C. Stephen Evans. Stephen Evans is a scholar who's done a lot of work on Kierkegaard and the fideist tradition, and yet he's very comfortable with evidentialism. Now, you would think that fideism and evidentialism would mix like oil and water. I mean, you would think that it just wouldn't work. And yet, in Evans' approach, fideism is not an irrationalism, and it is open to the use of evidence, but it has to be put within a particular context. And so he integrates both of those. In fact, he really finds something from all four approaches that he can use. And that's an example of somebody that tries to do that. And there are several others that have self-consciously gone about trying to integrate two or more of these approaches.
I'm curious what apologists may have been particularly influential to you personally.
Oh gosh, well, I've been influenced probably by so many that if I start singling some out, it might lead to some misperception of where I'm coming from. But I've been very influenced by theologically by Calvin and the Calvinist tradition. I don't know that I'm a card-carrying Calvinist for some people's money. I'm not a Presbyterian, for example, so I don't fit very neatly into that theological tradition, but I'm more or less Calvinist in my theological persuasion on a number of issues. So I've been influenced by that tradition, and I went to Westminster Theological Seminary, which is a bastion of presuppositionalism, and learned it from those that were closest to that school of thought. I've also been heavily influenced by people like Norman Geisler, who is, the kind of dean of classical apologetics today. I've been influenced very much by people like John Warwick Montgomery, who's an evidentialist. In fact, again, probably the dean of evidentialist apologetics for the last 40 years or so. So I've been influenced by thinkers of very different approaches to apologetics. I've also been influenced by people who were not self-consciously advocating an apologetic approach, but would normally fit into one of these or the other. Been influenced by various biblical scholars and philosophers, for example. And, I appreciate the different kinds of approaches that they have taken to defending various aspects of the Christian faith. And so those have all become part of, the way I think about it.
Well, Rob, as we begin to wrap up here, you've done a lot of work in Christian defense. You've taught it, you've done it, and you've written books all about it. Now, if you're speaking to students of apologetics, what sort of advice would you want to leave them with, or what advice would you want to give the next generation of Christian apologists?
Well, what I'm going to say now may help to balance out a little bit the emphasis that we placed on method, because it does deserve some emphasis. But I want to say to the younger generation, I think I can say that since I'm in my 50s now, that we desperately need many Christians to become excellent in their respective fields. We need Christian philosophers. We need Christians who are physicists, who are biologists, who are chemists, who are engineers, who are artists, who are theologians, of course. We've got a lot of those, but we can use some really good ones every generation. We need a lot of good ones. So we're always going to need that. We need good biblical scholars. We need good Christian evangelical Old Testament scholars who are not afraid to do primary research. We need good evangelical Christian archaeologists. We don't have as many of those as I'd like. We need people who, I'm not saying there aren't any, but we need more, and we need those who are really willing to pursue excellence in these fields, because very often Christian apologists find themselves settling for kind of recycled explanations or recycled arguments from decades gone by that really need to be updated. In some cases, it might even need to be abandoned because the evidence has now shown that approach didn't work. We need to have people who are current in the field, who know what they're talking about, and we need people who are not only excellent in their fields, but also we always are going to need people who are big picture people, who look at the different fields, look at biblical studies and science and philosophy, and try to see how they relate to one another, and try to see how they can, have some mutual reinforcement and feedback into one another. Because if the physicists are just doing physics and the Old Testament scholars are just doing Old Testament, guess what? We are not going to succeed in addressing apologetic issues very well pertaining to the origins of the world and what Genesis says about those kinds of subjects. We need people who can bridge the disciplines between science and biblical studies, for example. So those are the kinds of things that we need. And, of course, we need people to do that who are sensitive to these methodological concerns, who will at least give them enough attention so that they're not making fundamental mistakes or being overly narrow in the way that they go about what they're doing. But that's what we really need. We really need people who are saying, I'm going to be the best physicist I can be for the glory of God, and I'm going to use my knowledge and my expertise of this discipline to advance human knowledge in this area in a way that will bring glory to God. If we, this is what Christians historically used to do all the time, and we're not as well known for that now as we used to be. There's still some that are doing it, but we need to be on the cutting edge of these areas of thought. We need to be making the discoveries and doing the pioneering work that shows that Christianity is not retreating from the world of knowledge and science and so forth, but is actually helping to advance it. If we could be doing that, it would bring great credibility to the Christian faith in a way that has been kind of lacking for many people over the last couple of generations. So those are some things that I would say we desperately need. We need Christians who are willing to go into the halls of academia and face down the skeptics and the cynics and the secularists and get their PhDs and become skilled at what they're doing. Of course, we need people who are not academics as well to pick this stuff up, to learn Christian apologetics and teach it in their Sunday schools, teach it to the kids and children's Sunday school. We need pastors to teach the stuff from their pulpits, to encourage the Christians in their churches to learn why they believe what they believe. So there's a lot of needs here. Everybody can play a part in Christian apologetics. You don't have to have a PhD in philosophy or science. You don't have to be a theologian. Wherever you are, mothers, fathers, kids going to school, whatever it is, guys working on the job, apologetics can be a useful part of the Christian witness to a world that needs to know that Christianity is true.
Well, that's excellent insight and advice. Rob, I commend all your books and your materials to our listeners, and I want to really thank you for taking the time to speak with me today.
Hey, you're very welcome.
I've been speaking with Robert M. Bowman, Jr., the Director of Research at the Institute for Religious Research, found at www.IRR.org. You can find links to his resources, audio, and books at today's blog post at Apologetics315. If you've enjoyed today's interview, please share it with a friend via Facebook or Twitter. Remember to subscribe to this podcast in iTunes, as podcast episodes are released a day in advance of their blog posting. While you're in iTunes, please leave a positive review. This is Brian Auten of Apologetics315, and thanks for listening.